Good afternoon and welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name's Eileen Burkton. I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. If you're interested in these programs, please join our membership. You can let me know, or else you can go to preservelincoln.org. The videotaping today is sponsored by the Preservation Association of Lincoln. Our speaker today is Gary Bowen. Gary is an architect from Omaha and a principal at BVH Architecture for 43 years. He has a Bachelor's of Arts and a Master's of Architecture from UNL. He is a fellow with the American Institute of Architects. He has worked in the architecture profession for 53 years, including working at firms in London, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles, and Omaha. Gary was also a partner with Cedric Hartman and John Morford when they designed M's Pub in 1972. Gary's talk today is titled M's Pub, an old market icon reconstructed. Please join me in welcoming Gary.
Thanks, Eileen. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for inviting me today. Have you all heard of M's Pub in Omaha? I've been asked to talk about M's Pub, but I also want to expand on that a little bit because there are a lot of interesting sidebars to this story. And I'm going to talk about related to this project, all the aspects of working with older buildings in historic districts. Preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, reconstruction, all the buzzwords will apply to this project equally well. And I really want to explain the process that we're going through because although this started out looking fairly simple and straightforward, we're into the 18th month now, and it's turned out to be a fairly complicated and time-consuming and expensive process. This project is really special for me because, as Eileen said, my former firm, we did this project in 1972, and it's not often that an architect gets to go around the second time and do the same project twice. M's Pub, as you know, is located in the Old Market Historic District. It's a National Register property built in 1972, and it's one of the kind of mainstays in the Old Market. It was one of the first ones. The Old Market started in 1968 in Omaha, and this was one of the first ones that went in. And it developed into sort of an icon. I've talked to a lot of people anxious to know when it's going to reopen because they had their wedding anniversary there, or their birthday, or their class reunion. So it's developed that kind of special place in Omaha. The whole saga started on January 9th of last year. There was a company drilling underneath the street to put in communication cables, and they struck a gas line running into the M's Pub basement and ruptured the gas line, and gas migrated into the basement. It was ignited by a gas, or probably a water heater pilot light, and caused an explosion and fire. This was on a Saturday afternoon about 3 o'clock. There were only about 15 people in the restaurant, but it blew out the floor. Shards of glass were flying all over. Luckily, no one was seriously injured, or there were no fatalities. Actually, this was the second building on the site. The tall building on the right-hand side of the screen was the Mercer Hotel, built in 1880. And it was a 4-story building. And in 1905, it burned. So this is actually the third fire on this particular piece of property. After that fire in 1905, the Mercer family, who owned the previous building and owns much of the property in the old market, they rebuilt soon after that first fire, and this was the building that replaced it, built in 1905. Most of these buildings in the old market, it gets its name from the fact that it was a vegetable and fruit produce center. Farmers and truck farmers would bring their produce into the old market, stored in these warehouses owned by wholesalers, and the wholesalers would sell it to grocery stores. But even as recent as 10, 15 years ago, you could still go down to the old market and buy produce from vendors off the street. This building was built by the Mercers as a banana storage warehouse, four floors high, and it extended all the way to the alley there on the right-hand side. Not bad for a warehouse. Brick facade. It was, you can see 8 bays wide. And in plan, the area in yellow are the 2 bays that we're working with. In 1949, the right side of the building burned, leaving the 2 bays there in yellow. And the large building to the left is called the 420 building. It was totaled in the fire as well, not from fire, but from water and smoke damage. And these warehouses were really something. They were built to hold tremendous weight. They had high ceilings, exposed wood structure, exterior brick load-bearing walls. The first floor height is about 16 feet, and they had these metal canopies over the sidewalk where the vendors would come out and display their wares. The upper floors were probably 12-foot floor to floor, and they had sloping roofs for drainage. After the fire, Mark Mercer called me and said, the city came out and issued a demolition order today. This was a few days after the fire. He said, I want you to help me take a look at it, see if we can save this building. And this is what it looked like when I came up and looked at it several days after the fire. Keep in mind, this is January 9th. It was about 10 degrees outside. The fire department sprayed water on it for 16 hours, and everything had about a foot of ice on it. So the first thing I did was call Steve Kelly, who's a nationally renowned forensic architect and engineer, who we work with on the state capitol restoration and other projects around the country. That's Steve, second from the left. Mark Mercer and his associate is there on the right. So about a week later, after the fire, Steve came to Omaha, and we set about to try and analyze the condition of the building, see if it could be saved. The first thing we did was went to Bass Pro Shops, and we bought some crampons to strap on our feet. This is what ice fishermen use to walk around on the ice. Because you couldn't get near this building because of all the ice, it was very dangerous. The city wouldn't let anyone in it or near it because of the fear of the walls would collapse or icicles would fall on someone. So we couldn't get inside the building, so we hired a 20-ton crane with a bucket. And Steve and I, in this photo, are up in that bucket about 75 feet in the air. And they lowered us down inside the shell of the building. And that's the only way we could get close to it and poke around and see what condition it was in. It was kind of exciting up there, 75 feet in the air with the wind blowing and the wind chill at about 10 degrees. But the view is nice. And this is what we saw. The building was in 2 bays. The bay on the north side with the M's Pub on the first floor was a total loss. Everything had collapsed down onto the basement, sort of like the Twin Towers when that catastrophe happened. Once the roof collapsed, it took the 3rd floor down to the 2nd floor, and everything ended up in the basement. On the right-hand side, the bottom of the bottom part of the photo here, only the roof was gone. The Mercers, Mark and Vera, lived on the top floor in that space. And of course, as you can see, they lost everything. Vera is a world-class photographer, and her first concern was her computer hard drive and her files, because she wanted, the first thing she asked, if they could lower the bucket into her apartment there and see if we could reclaim or find any of her computer files. But as you could see, that was hopeless because there was a foot of ice and debris on everything. The good news later, though, she did reclaim some of her negatives in her files. But that's what we saw. This is looking into the north half, and as you can see, most of the material is collapsed into the basement. The main concern was this wall on the right-hand side of the photo. It's a 4-story unsupported brick wall. And remember, that used to be an interior wall originally, because there were 2 more bays on there before the fire destroyed that half of the building in 1949. So here was this wall about 50 feet high, no lateral support, never intended to be an exterior wall, made out of common brick with soft mortar that had been exposed to the elements for the last 110 years. And that's what the city was concerned about. That's why they issued the demo order. They were afraid the wind would blow it over. So Steve poked around. He took soundings into the wall to see if it was hollow or if it was sound. And he took mortar samples, and that's the only way we could touch the building is through this bucket that was lowered down from the crane. So we went to the city and said, look, we think we can save this building. And they said, well, we've issued a demo order. We'll give you 90 days to come up with a plan to stabilize it and develop a time schedule and a process. Tell us what you're going to do, and we'll think about it. So we staved them off for 90 days and developed a stabilization plan. This is a interior view of that north brick wall. That was our main concern. It was to figure out a way to temporarily hold that up until we could start figuring out how to reconstruct the building. And as you can see, there was quite a bit of damage. You can see the horizontal lines where the floor joists were embedded into the walls. You can see some brick arches. These were ran north and south through all 4 bays, and these arches were used as openings to transport the goods back and forth through the building. There was a lot of damage from the fire into the wall. The interesting thing, though, the one thing that survived inside were there was a column line that ran down the middle of each of the bays. The bays are 33 feet wide, so the columns were about 16, 17 feet running through the middle, and they had these large 16-inch by 24-inch support beams onto which the floor joists rested. And you can see what happened. The beams had about 1/4 of an inch of char on the outside. Otherwise, they were perfectly sound. And this is a good testament to the comparison of steel versus wood construction, heavy timber. Had these been steel, they would have melted and ended up like a rubber band. Steel can't tolerate heat. Wood, heavy timber, can. And although the joist collapsed because of the weight, not the fire, But the beams and these cast iron columns survived, and we were able to reuse some of them and reclaim those beams. I counted the rings on the one on the right, and I ran out of space at about 200 years. And that's probably a all-heart virgin Douglas fir tree that was cut out of in 1905. And there's a shot of the beams that were reclaimed and sold for about $5,000, because there are companies that take these old beams and cut them into logs and make furniture out of them. We hired another engineer, Kip Squire in Omaha, to come up with a plan to stabilize the walls and the floors before we could start doing any reconstruction. So he came up with this idea of creating these interior box beams that are bolt anchored into the sidewalls to provide lateral support. And this is the top floor on the former Mercer apartment. And you can see we had a floor to work with on the south side, so he put these braces up, anchored them to the floor and the walls to keep the walls from falling over. So after the stabilization process, we went back to the city and said, we've got it stabilized. Here's what the next step is going to be. We're going to start cleaning it out and developing the plans to put the building pieces and parts back together. That stabilization process took about 3 or 4 months. So then we had to clean out the building before we could start putting the floors back together. And again, that's what we started with. And you couldn't go in and start carrying this out piece by piece because of the danger and the risk of injury. This is a view from the sidewalk. The M's pub space is the one on the right-hand side there. And you can see the dilemma of trying to figure out what to keep, what to try and salvage. The bottom line there wasn't any salvage because everything was pulverized and squashed because of the weight of the floors and the roof. We were hoping to find some of the marble countertops and some of the furniture, but all the chairs, stools, bar, ductwork, lighting, everything was totaled. The space next to M's on the same first floor, Nouvelle Eve it was called, was a high-end women's clothing store, boutique. And as you can see, it was more or less intact. However, because of all the water that was pumped onto the building that came down through the floors and the roof, they lost all the contents. But the floors were intact, and the space was more or less salvageable. So the contractor was hired, Lund Ross Construction Company in Omaha, and they started extracting all the debris with this front end loader, and it had this big claw on the front, and they started going in through the front windows and grabbing onto as much as they could and hauling it out. And that's the only safe way that they could do this. So they couldn't get in and do it by hand. So eventually they built a ramp down into the basement and started hauling it out with a front end loader. Long, complicated, dangerous, time-consuming process. Here are the only things that were salvaged, and remarkably, on the right-hand side, in M's Pub, there were 2 brass candlesticks that sat on the bar, probably the most delicate items in the whole place, and both of those were the only things that they salvaged. And originally, Cedric Hartman found those at Drew's Antiques, and they were a Jewish candelabra or a menorah, and we turned the hands the arms 45 degrees and created a candelabra, polished it up, made a new base for it, and since then those have been reclaimed and restored and they're ready to go back in. The only other thing on the south side, they had these hoists, and this was the equipment on the top floor that they used to bring the hoists up and down. It was a sort of a poor man's elevator that they used to haul the bananas, I guess, up and down the floors. So this is, after all this debris was taken out, this is kind of back to the beginning. This is what we started with after the clean out was done. You can see the columns and some of the beams were retained, the cast iron columns. So the first part of the reconstruction process started dealing with the masonry. We had to get those exterior masonry bearing walls in place before we could put floors and the roof back in place. A lot of the tops of the walls were blown off from the high pressure fire hoses, and of course this was 110-year-old masonry. It wasn't particularly good shape, and it didn't take a lot. In some places you could go up and grab a brick off the top. It would come off without too much effort. So a masonry contractor was hired, and he started cleaning up the brick and kind of analyzing what he had to deal with. As you can see on the right, there was a lot of spalling from the heat, intense heat from the fire. The face of the brick just popped off. This mortar was soft. It was probably a type O mortar, which is a very soft mortar for common brick, and it wasn't in very good shape. The other problem, a lot of the brick was gone or broken or crushed, so we had to go out and find brick, reclaimed brick that was taken out of other similar buildings to use to rebuild some of the brick walls. Fortunately, we were able to find enough to do that. The other thing we did during the analysis process was to take mortar samples. And as you can see, there were multiple different kinds and colors of mortar. The outside face of the building was actually a hard face brick. All the other walls were soft common brick. There was colored mortar in the front face brick. There were different types of mortar that we found on the inside. And of course, this being an historic building, we had to comply with restoration standards that were set up by the Omaha Landmarks Commission, which had jurisdiction over everything we did in this building, being a historic district. So we sent these samples off to Denver to a testing lab, and they came back and told us what the composition was, what the bearing capacity was, and we then went back and used that criteria in the reconstruction. The entire building was tuck-pointed. Tuck-pointing means we cut out the joints and reinstalled probably the first half inch or so of mortar on all the joints, inside, outside, front, back. And we did some sampling. This is a common practice in restoration work. Is on the left you can see two different colors of mortar. So we did a couple of colors to make sure we get the color right. We did some testing there on the right side with a sample to verify that we're getting the color. It took 2 or 3 tries, but we did get the color right. After tuck pointing, there's a lot of residue and mortar that's left over and on the face of the brick. So the next step then was to clean the brick. Of course, this had 110 years plus of soot and dirt and carbon residue from the fire. So on the right-hand side, you can see the test results there of cleaning the mortar in that lighter portion. And these two slides, the one on the right shows the entire tuck pointing done and the cleaning complete on the outside of the building. And on the left, that was that was what it was like before we cleaned it. This white residue you can see on both sides is what's called efflorescence. Keep in mind this building was, they pump water into it onto those walls for 16 hours. So it was soaked with water. And eventually, when it warms up, that moisture has a tendency to want to come out to the surface, and it brings with it materials, minerals and salts from the mortar, and that causes this film on the outside. So over time that can be cleaned off, but that's what you see on both slides, the white material. So this shows the reconstruction starting on that tall 4-story high north wall. And the masons are rebuilding some of the arches and starting from the top down, building the wall back together. The wall was 24 inches at the basement level, and it stepped in 2 inches on each level, and I think it was 16 inches thick on the top. And it had ledges on it. Each of those floors stepped in 2 inches, and that's where the beam pockets were, the joist pockets. You can see where the floor joists were placed. These are the reconstructed arches. The masons did a wonderful job of building frames and putting those arches back together. The one on the left was an existing one. The one on the right, I think, is a new one. So they were able to recreate those almost exactly. So after the walls were done, after the masonry was restored, the next step was what we call the core and shell. That is to put the insides back together. This included floors and roofs, and then we had to put in stairwells and other circulation elements like corridors. We had to do all of this so that it complies with code and historic preservation standards. This is the building on the left is the 420 building, which I mentioned earlier, which was it was a 5-story building, built about the same time. It also had a restaurant on the first floor, and it had condominiums on the top 4 floors. I think there were 12 or 15 condominiums. And the two buildings shared a common exit way. If you lived in the 420 building, you could come through a door there in the middle common wall, and you could exit down the fire stair in the Mercer building. It was a strange situation, but that's the way it was, and the city, fortunately, allowed that same situation to go back in. Another interesting aspect, you see that little notch in the middle of the top of the slide. When the building ran all the way to the alley, they left this light well between the two buildings to let light into the 420 building on the left and the Mercer building on the right. And that's, of course, still there. So we started putting the floors back together. The floors, the first 2 floors, as I said, were designed for very heavy loading. The joists are 3x16s at 16-inch on center, which is about 4 times more load than you probably have in your house. And on the first floor, we determined we could save about 20 feet of the original floor joist. That's what you see on the right side, the ones with the char on it. And that's an original beam. So when you go back into M's, hopefully you won't notice it, but there is a portion of the original floor that we retained and salvaged. And on the left you can see the new joists and the new beams. And we, of course, reused the existing cast iron columns. But that's the floor. In case anybody ever wants to drive a Sherman tank through there, I'm sure it would support it. You can see those windows in that light well up in the upper portion. That was an interesting feature in the restaurant. It let light in, and so we had to start also buttoning up the outside, putting the windows and doors and storefronts back in place. Another interesting aspect on the right-hand side, that's the M's Pub Bay. We were actually able to retain and reuse some of the original wood storefront mullions. And that was where the hottest part of the fire was, right there in that stairwell in front of M's. But lo and behold, those wood window frames survived, and we kept them. And here you can see the new storefront in place on the right-hand slide. The left-hand slide is right after the fire, so it turned out pretty nice. I should explain that we're about 18 months into the reconstruction after the fire. The hope is that the restaurant will be back and operational about the 1st of October, so we still got a ways to go. And it was only in November of last year that the owners decided to go back in. So it was in doubt for almost a year whether or not the restaurant would even happen again. The slide on the left shows all the windows were destroyed or blown out or damaged in the fire. So we had to work with the Omaha Landmarks Commission on new windows. And in fact, everything on the exterior of the building they have jurisdiction over, and we had to get the masonry restoration approved, the mortar samples had to be approved, and we had to get the windows replicated and approved by the Landmarks Commission before those could go in. So on the right you can see all the windows are back in place. The original windows, of course, were wood sash, single glazing. The new windows have insulated glass and had to meet the energy code as well. There were 4 or 5 layers of governmental agencies that we had to comply with: the Landmarks Commission, the building department, the energy codes, the ADA codes. There were urban design guidelines we had to comply with, so that was the complicated part. But the whole reason for that, of course, is to retain the integrity and the original character of this historic district. And it's worth the effort and the cost. All the interior window trim was duplicated and restored back to the original. These arches that I told you about that ran through the north-south direction in the building, they were a feature in M's restaurant. This is the one that, if you remember, is in the south wall that you could look into the Nouvelle Eve space, and they were able to reconstruct those wood frames per the original. So after we got the whole building put back together, that is the shell and the floors and the roof and the windows and the masonry work done, this is about the time that it was determined. The owners came to us and said, you know, we love it so much, we want to go back and do M's Pub again. At the time it was owned by 2 people, Ron Samuelson and Ann Mellon. At that point, Samuelson decided that he didn't want to be part of the reconstruction process, so he sold his interest to Ann Mellon, who's now the sole owner and the one we're working with to reconstruct it. And her charge to us was, she said, I want to put this back exactly the way it was, which is a noble intention, but with today's codes 45 years after the fact, it's not always possible to do it exactly right, but that was her intent. As you can see, when we designed it originally, the intent was really to let the building speak for itself, and it was really a process of subtraction, not decoration like it is done in a lot of buildings, but to let the attributes of the old building speak for itself. So we painted the walls, painted the ceiling, built a bar, built a small kitchen there on the left, picked out some furniture, and that's resulted in M's Pub. I told you about our previous firm at that time was Hartman, Morford, Bowen. Cedric Hartman, if you know that name, Cedric is almost a genius, I would say. He's developed this exquisite line of reading lamps and interior furnishings that he markets to the cream of the crop, the architects and the interior designers all over the world. Morford, after our firm split up, he moved to Hong Kong and worked for I.M. Pei and other world-class architects on projects in the Orient. He's still there. M's was started by Mary Vogel, who's the person on the left. Mary was a Omaha socialite. Her husband was the president of Omaha National Bank. She had the means and the interest to. She wanted to do something significant and important. So that was our original client in 1972, and that's where the name came from. Her nickname was M. Ann Mellon is the person on the right who we're working with currently and now owns or will own M's. This is the floor plan of M's Pub in the beginning. As you can see, the bar was the piece right there in the middle, and a little caboose-type kitchen there on the top. There were restrooms in the basement and the bakery in the basement, some freezers and coolers in the basement. In those days, you had to go down these stairs up in the top center to get to the restrooms. Wasn't ideal, but that was before ADA was implemented, so we decided to try and do something a little different. We had to do something a little different. Either that or put in an elevator, and there really wasn't room to do that. This was John Morford's original drawing. In those days, that was, I think that was pre-computer CAD drafting. There might have been CAD drafting in some of the bigger firms, but we did everything by hand in those days. And Morford did these beautiful ink drawings on vellum, and that's the blueprints. That's how they built the building. John also did this poster. Some of you may have seen that around. This was done at the time of the opening as kind of a gift to Mary Vogel, and these have become collector's items now. But this was done to commemorate the opening of M's Pub in 1972. This is a plan of the current project. Fortunately, Mark Mercer owned 16 feet along the north side of the building. That's the yellow area outline on the top. So we're putting the restrooms and the kitchen in that 16-foot strip and putting the non-public functions in the basement, like the coolers and the freezers and the storage space in the basement. But the interior of the original restaurant hopefully will look exactly the same. That's the basement. The basement had these curious, I'd call them subways, that hollowed out areas under the sidewalk, and they were probably used, they had chutes in them, and they would deliver coal there to the furnaces and the boilers in the basement. And they have these interesting cast iron grates with glass rondels that let light into that's how they lit the basement. There's a lot of stuff that goes in a restaurant, as you can see. Kitchen equipment, bar equipment, freezers, coolers, ovens, dishwashing equipment. These drawings show the pieces that go back in. As you recall, M's had this caboose-type kitchen, which is the drawing on the bottom center, and that's going in more or less exactly the way it was before. Same size, same materials. The material palette is essentially what it was before. Green slate floors in the wet areas, the bar and the restrooms. It was quite a challenge to find the furniture to match the original. The chair in the upper left we discovered was called a caboose chair. It was designed originally in the 20s and 30s to be used in cabooses, in trains. I think people probably would call it now a captain's chair or something like that. But we did find a dead replicate in Ohio, I think in a Mennonite industry. Shops make those. The stools, we found something that's exactly the way it was. One of the hardest things was to find the stone there in the right that was used on the countertop. This was one of the main features of the place, this beautiful green marble. And we searched and searched and finally found a quarry in Vermont that still produces, and they confirmed that it was exactly the same material. The surprise, however, was it's not marble. It's called serpentine stone, which is a stone that has the similar properties as granite. It's very hard, and to be on a bar top for 45 years and resist water stains and alcohol and scratches, and it was spotless. This serpentine stone is that hard. The last slides show what this outside addition looked like. Now this was a whole different design challenge because it had to go through all the governmental approval processes, and the challenge really was to do something that sort of disappeared when you walk by. So it's a simple shed type structure with black corrugated metal, which you find a lot of places in the old market. Corrugated metal is on the canopy roofs and a lot of different other, it's a warehouse type industrial material. The other problem was there's a lot of equipment sitting on the roof of that addition for the kitchen equipment and condensers for the building, and so we created this wooden screen that will be painted green that will be used to plant vines on, and it screens the mechanical units on the roof. And the entrance to the 420 building is that door on the right-hand side of the picture. So they were very concerned about what was next to their front walkway. So we had to do quite a bit of work to get them on board, which we did. So hopefully when you walk by it, you won't even give it a second thought. It wasn't a big design feature. It was, again, a background piece to the whole equation. So the last slide, I clipped out a couple of things from the newspaper. There's been a lot of press and publicity about the project. And I like the one on the right there. This guy said, you can't replace it or replicate it. Well, we're giving it a good college try. And I hope in a couple of months when you go back, or if you go back, you can walk in and you probably won't notice too much difference from the beginning. Thank you. I'd be glad to answer any questions. Bob?
I'm sure Professor Malmo acknowledged this, but why did the cast iron survive?
The question was, why did the cast iron column survive the fire?
And the fronts, the storefronts.
Yes, and the storefront too. I'm not a expert on that, Bob, but I suspect that it has properties like the heavy timber that and being in a vertical application as opposed to a horizontal application, it resisted the heat, whereas a horizontal beam would have melted. Another interesting thing about the steel that I failed to mention is the canopy out front had, we estimated 20 tons of ice on it, and half of it collapsed. The part over M's Pub collapsed, but the other part had a tremendous weight on the top of it, so it didn't make it either. Yes?
Is there no district energy corporation in the old market that would allow you to eliminate on-premise HVAC systems?
The question was, is there, if I understand your question, is there a company or a...
Yeah, Omaha has 2 district energy facilities, one over by TD Ameritrade Park and one up, I think, on Farnham, about 19th. And they supply chill and heated air to customers.
Oh, I get you. Yes, I understand the question.
Which eliminates the need to put a boiler or condensers or anything else. No such connection exists down in the old market.
So the question was, is there an entity in Omaha that has supplies energy underground to facilities downtown? And yes, there is. I'm not sure that it goes through the old market. I don't think it does. So we had to provide our own integral HVAC system for the whole building. One interesting thing, when I was talking about the gas leak, after the fire started, the fire department got there in about 10 minutes. They started pumping water on the fire, put it out, and they called MUD, the gas company, to come and shut off the gas. And the fire erupted back up in the meantime, and the fire department was reluctant to start pumping water back on the fire because they didn't want to put it out, let the gas build up again and cause another explosion. Long story short, it took MUD an hour and 20 minutes to get there to figure out where the shutoff was, which happened to be under a parked car. They had to get a tow truck to tow that out. And by that time, the building was gone. The fire had completely destroyed it. And interestingly enough, the fire marshal about 2 months ago came out publicly and stated that, in their opinion, MUD was at fault in this, and had they been able to respond in a timely manner and get the gas shut off, much of the building and the contents could have been saved. So that was kind of an interesting revelation. That, meanwhile, there are lawsuits underway and will probably be underway for the next decade. Yes?
We just spoke about lawsuits, but what's the total cost here? Who's paying it? And then the Nouvelle Eve and everything above? Are you guys involved in restoring that too?
The question is, what's happening with the building, with the rest of the building? Is it going to be repopulated? Nouvelle Eve is planning to go back in. We are working with them. Their damage, as you saw, was much less critical. The upper floors, the whole building is owned by the Mercers. The upper floors are what's called white boxed. That is, we just did the shell, the windows, the floors, painted the walls, and put in heating, air conditioning, and they're ready to lease or sell. Other questions?
What are the costs?
Okay, yes, that was part of the previous question. What are the costs? In 1972, M's Pub cost about $100,000 to put in place. Today, the estimated cost is $1.2 million, just for the restaurant. The rest of the building, I don't have the final costs on that, but that's probably over $2 million to put the rest of the building back together. That was the insurance settlement. I do know that for the whole building shell, that was the payout was $2 million, which was considered a total loss. It's probably going to cost more than that to put it back together.
In restoring the building, what did you do to enhance it? What things did you add to it?
The question was, what did we do to enhance the building during the whole renovation and restoration? Well, all the windows are new, more energy conservation there, the insulation on the roof where there was none before. All the brick has been tuck pointed and in some cases replaced. All new HVAC systems, all new electrical service, all new lighting. So this is essentially a new building in historic clothing. Any other questions? Yes.
I've been in a few burned buildings and they cleaned it up and that, but it still smells. How do you get rid of that odor?
Well, the question is, how to get rid of the odor after a fire, and that's a big challenge. In the Mercer building, on the right-hand side, there wasn't much left. There wasn't much left to absorb the smell. On the 420 building, which is next to it, that was a total loss, not because of the fire, but because of water and smoke damage and mold. Since the floors were all intact, the insulation was still in, the carpet was in, all of that soaked up the water and eventually turned into mold and mildew. They've got a real problem there. I think we're about out of time. Thank you for attention, and again, thanks for inviting me.